Today, we're doing more than just talking about migration. We're really peeling back the layers on, well, a brutal, hidden economy, one that profits from human desperation. And we're asking a tough question. Are our own international policies, maybe even the well-intentioned ones, inadvertently fueling this whole criminal enterprise? We often focus, and rightly so, on compassion for people arriving at our shores, but there's this crucial new research forcing us to look at what's driving millions from their homes in the first place. We're zooming in on Ethiopia today, which is interesting because, it's seeing rapid economic growth, but it's still a major source of irregular migration. Get this, something like 60 to 70% of Ethiopians who leave, they do it irregularly, often falling right into the hands of traffickers. So this deep dive, it's really about uncovering the uncomfortable truth behind those numbers. Welcome, everyone. Our mission today is to pull the key insights from some important research. We're looking at reports from Ethiopian universities, the Mixed Migration Center, UNODC, and the Athens Public International Law Center. We want to give you a really clear, comprehensive picture of irregular migration from East Africa, the human cost, which is just heartbreaking, and the tangle of legal and criminal challenges involved.
Yeah, and what's really compelling, I think, is how these different sources connect. You've got, like you said, specific studies right there in Ethiopia on the ground. But then we're also blending those with these broader international analyses, legal perspectives. So it creates this multi-layered view. It helps us see not just what's going on, but really why. Why are people taking these unbelievably risky journeys? Why do they feel like it's the only option?
Okay, so let's dive right into that, this paradox. Ethiopia, growing economically, but so many people leaving irregularly. What is really pushing people out, especially when, on paper, the country's doing better?
That's the core of it, isn't it? And it's a key finding. National growth, if it's not spread evenly, well, it can actually make things worse for individuals. It can create this internal push, even while the overall statistics look good. We see widespread poverty, unemployment, underemployment, hitting families hard, even if the GDP is rising. For example, land. Scarcity of land, poor soil fertility, particularly in areas like South Wollo, and then you add rapid population growth on top of that. People just can't make a living off the land they have access to. It's not sustainable. And the wage gap, it's just staggering. You mentioned the average local salary, maybe around 1,078 Ethiopian birr a month. Compare that to what people think they can earn abroad, particularly in Arab countries. The difference is huge. Then you have environmental factors like recurring droughts. Always a threat. And while it's mostly economic drivers reported, in some specific areas like Tigray, you also hear about the political situation, that no war, no peace scenario being a factor.
That's a really stark picture of the push factors. But given this economic growth, is there anything in the research suggesting that maybe government efforts to boost the economy might, unintentionally be making things worse in some areas, like maybe displacing rural people or creating bigger income gaps? Because you said it's not just the poorest people leaving, right?
That's a really sharp question. The sources don't explicitly say government economic policies are causing displacement directly in that way, but they definitely show the benefits of growth aren't reaching everyone equally. There's a distributional problem. And you're absolutely right. It's not solely the most destitute who leave. The studies show that even people considered better off are looking at irregular migration. They see it as a way for, quick life improvement, a faster track. The profile tends to be young people, often literate, single, low to medium education and skills generally, from sort of middle-sized families, predominantly male, yes, but there's also significant female migration, often going for domestic work, like housemaids. And interestingly, urban youth seem more vulnerable. Why? Well, they're just exposed to more information about migration, more influences, maybe through social media, friends. It creates this kind of social contagion. And if you connect that to the bigger picture, it becomes clear these aren't just thousands of individual isolated choices. There's a very real transnational system operating here. It actively promotes and facilitates this irregular movement. The pull factor, the lure of better opportunities, higher salaries, even if people know the conditions can be terrible, it's incredibly powerful. It creates what the researchers call a differential concept. Basically, the gap between how bad things seem at home and how good things might be abroad seems so vast.
Yep.
It just outweighs the known risks of the journey itself. It's about that relative desperation versus perceived opportunity. Saudi Arabia, for instance, is often described as a kind of labor reserve, pulling in cheap labor from Ethiopia.
Right. And that brings us to the really dark side of this, the networks facilitating it all. You hear traffickers and you think of shadowy figures, but the research suggests it's much more embedded, more insidious. So who are these actors beyond just the obvious criminals? Because if families and even like local businesses are involved, how do you even begin to tackle that? Does that mean it's almost too deep in the social fabric for just, police work alone?
That's an excellent point. And yes, it's much more complex than just traffickers. They are central, of course, the brokers. But the networks are wider, more diffuse. They often include family members, parents, friends. Sometimes unintentionally, sometimes directly, they foster this culture of migration. You also have these informal services people providing information, transport, money transfers, specifically for smuggling and trafficking. And what's really quite chilling is how normal it can seem in some places. Even migrants who've already made it to destination countries might then become brokers themselves. And yes, it's deeply embedded. The reports mention hotels, shops, even coffee houses and cafes acting as these informal information points, money channels, temporary shelters. So it's less like a single criminal gang and more like an entire ecosystem. And these networks, they facilitate specific routes. People don't choose irregular routes because they're safe, far from it. Often it's because they think it's cheaper, about a third side cost, or because regular channels are just inaccessible, that's about 27%, or blocked by bureaucracy, 18% common routes. Well, from the Afar region towards Bosaso in Somalia or Djibouti, then across into Yemen. From Yemen, it's often towards Saudi Arabia or sometimes through Sudan, towards Libya, and then hoping to reach Europe. And the risks, they're just immense. Horrific, really. Financial exploitation is rampant. Physical assault, psychological abuse, hunger, thirst, sexual violence, detention, deportation, kidnapping, and tragically, death. It's common. In fact, migrants themselves often say surviving these journeys is just pure luck. They admit it was totally beyond their personal capacity to avoid the dangers. It's a gamble. And this exploitation isn't just by traffickers. It can be employers, illegal brokers, private employment agents, even sometimes security forces along the way.
Pure luck. Just think about that for a second. The desperation that makes someone gamble everything on pure luck. It tells you so much about the hopelessness they feel back home. These journeys, especially the sea crossings, are just filled with unbelievable risks. And that's where another critical piece comes in, the responsibility piece. International law. Once people are at sea, in distress, what legal protections should they have? And who really is responsible when things go so terribly wrong?
It's a vital question. And maritime law is actually pretty clear on the basics. The International Legal Framework for Search and Rescue, SAR, it's built on fundamental duties, like the duty to rescue anyone you find in distress at sea. It doesn't matter who they are, their nationality, their status, none of that. These aren't just, suggestions in dusty law books. They're core principles in major conventions like UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention, SOLAS, the Safety of Life at Sea Convention, and the SAR Convention itself. They all basically say, if someone's life is at risk at sea, you have an obligation to assist. And that includes taking them to a place of safety, which isn't just any port. It means somewhere their life is no longer threatened, where basic needs can be met, and where their longer-term situation can be properly addressed. So the big question becomes, if a state can help but doesn't, can they be held responsible for what happens next?
And the really crucial protection here is this principle of non-refoulement. That sounds technical, but it's vital. It's in Article 33 of the 1951 Refugee Convention. Basically, it says you cannot send someone back or refoul them to a place where their life or freedom would be threatened. And crucially, courts have said this applies even outside a country's own territory. There was a landmark case, the Hirsi Jamaa case, at the European Court of Human Rights. Italy was found responsible for violating non-refoulement because they intercepted migrants in international waters and sent them back to Libya. That case established that human rights obligations can apply extraterritorially. Your responsibility doesn't just stop at your own border or coastline. That fundamentally changes things.
Exactly. And that principle, that responsibility, directly impacts how we view the role of EU agencies like Frontex. Frontex manages external borders, right? But its joint operations, like the one called Operation Triton, often involve search and rescue. They become effectively huge SAR operations. So Frontex itself gets drawn into these SAR responsibilities. It's not just coastal states anymore. Pinpointing exact responsibility in these complex multinational operations can be tricky, legally speaking. But it often comes down to who has effective control over the situation and the people involved. And as the Hirsi Jamaa case showed, that control can definitely extend beyond national borders.
Okay, so let's shift focus a bit. After these incredibly dangerous journeys, what are the outcomes for those who actually make it? And what about the impact back home? What are the long-term effects we see?
Well, for those who do make it and can send money back, remittances are a huge positive impact. Definitely, they've grown sharply. In Ethiopia, for instance, the figures jumped significantly from maybe $1.5 billion in 2014 up to around $3.7 billion by 2016. And that money, it gets used for really vital things: building houses, buying livestock, starting small businesses, paying for education. It improves livelihoods for many families, no question.
That sounds like a strong case for migration then, in a way. But doesn't it also create a kind of dependence? Is it really sustainable? Or does it just mask the underlying problems?
You've put your finger right on the key tension there. The research calls this the scarce sustainability of these benefits. It's a lifeline, yes. It can pull families out of immediate crisis, but it often creates this fragile dependency. If that money stops flowing, maybe the migrant loses their job, gets deported, whatever, the family back home isn't just back to square one. They might actually be worse off. They have higher expectations now, maybe debts taken on against future earnings. And you see this in how many returnees actually say they want to migrate again. It shows the root issues haven't gone away. And it's fascinating, really, how economic inequality can be both a cause and an effect of this irregular migration. It fuels it, but the remittances can also create new inequalities, fostering this social culture where migration feels like the only path up. Plus, a lot of that remittance money tends to flow into urban areas for building or investment rather than developing rural areas, which might, kind of ironically, spur more people to move from the countryside into the cities within Ethiopia, looking for opportunities that might not be there.
And that connects to another issue, doesn't it? This idea of onward migration. People don't always stay in the first country they reach. They might move on again, maybe from Libya towards Europe, like you mentioned, because there are no jobs or protection where they landed first. And big global events like COVID-19. Obviously, that restricted movement for a while. But it also hammered economies everywhere, right? Making hardship worse. Could that actually be building up pressure for more irregular journeys in the future? So when you put all these pieces together, the push, the pull, the networks, the risks, the impacts, the onward movement, what does it all mean for governments trying to actually manage this? Are the current policies working? Or are they, like we wanted at the start, maybe even making parts of the problem worse?
It absolutely means that policy responses have got to be much broader, much more nuanced than just border control. There are initiatives, like the Khartoum process, that's a dialogue between the EU and countries in the Horn of Africa. And Ethiopia has its own framework, the CRRF, aimed at refugees, but also touching on root causes. But the research strongly recommends a really comprehensive migration and youth-centered policy, focusing on creating decent work locally and on what they call polycentric sustainable human development, which is basically a fancy way of saying development shouldn't just be top-down or focused only on the capital city. It needs to be spread out, empowering local areas, giving people real, viable futures right where they are. And alongside that, yes, you absolutely need to effectively criminalize migrant smuggling. Not the migrants themselves, but the smugglers profiting from them. You need to increase public awareness of the risks, really hammer home how dangerous these journeys are. But crucially, you also need to provide more formal channels for legal migration. Make them transparent, make them accessible. If people see no legal way out, they'll take the irregular one. So the challenge, really, it isn't just about managing borders. It's about tackling those deep-seated drivers: poverty, lack of opportunity. It's about disrupting the criminal businesses that thrive on desperation. And all the while upholding the basic human rights of people in distress, especially that duty to rescue at sea. It's a huge balancing act.
Wow. This deep dive has really laid bare the complex web of irregular migration, hasn't it? From those deep push and pull factors driving individuals to risk everything, to the pervasive, almost systemic criminal networks profiting from it all. And then this critical evolving role of international law and state responsibility, especially when people are in danger at sea. We started off asking if our own policies might be part of the problem. And what we've seen is this incredibly complex, frankly heartbreaking ecosystem, where individual hope crashes against global systems and the lines around rescue, responsibility, and even borders get incredibly blurry.
It definitely leaves you thinking, doesn't it? And perhaps a final thought for everyone listening to consider is this. When you have profound economic despair meeting the sheer opportunity for illicit profit, and at the same time, international laws about protection and rescue are facing real challenges in how they're enforced. How can we truly strike that balance between national sovereignty, managing borders, and upholding what seems like a fundamental human right, the right to seek a better, safer life?
A really powerful question, and one that definitely lingers long after this conversation ends. Thank you so much for joining us on this vital exploration today. We really hope you'll continue thinking about and exploring these critical issues.